In 1718, somewhere off the coast of West Africa, a surgeon named Richard Moore watched from the deck of a merchant vessel as a pirate ship closed in. He was a trained medical man, educated, skilled with a blade in ways that could save a life rather than take one. And when the pirates boarded his ship, they didn't kill him. They didn't rob him and toss him overboard. They kidnapped him, not for ransom, not for sport. They took Richard Moore because he was the single most valuable person on that entire vessel. More valuable than the captain, more valuable than the cargo. Because out on the open ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest port, a man who could stop you from bleeding to death was worth more than gold. Moore would spend nearly 6 years aboard pirate ships. 6 years performing surgery by candlelight in the belly of a rocking vessel, cutting into screaming men with no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and no guarantee that the patient or the surgeon would survive the night. He served under multiple captains, watched crews rise and fall, and became one of the longest-serving pirate surgeons in recorded history. And his story is far from unique. Because during the golden age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1725, the pirate surgeon occupied a position unlike anything else on the ship. He was simultaneously the most protected and the most terrorized crew member, the most respected and the most trapped. The one man nobody wanted to fight, because everybody might need him before the sun went down. This is the story of what it actually meant to be a surgeon on a pirate ship. And trust me, it was nothing like the movies. Now, to understand why pirate surgeons mattered so much, you need to understand what the world looked like in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Picture the Caribbean on a map. Imagine the trade routes stretching from the ports of Kingston, Jamaica, across to the coast of Africa, up through the Atlantic, to the bustling harbors of London and Lisbon. These were the highways of the age, and they were crawling with ships carrying sugar, spices, silk, and enslaved people. And they were crawling with pirates. The golden age of piracy exploded across these waters like a fever. Former privateers who had lost their government contracts turned rogue. Disgruntled sailors who had been beaten and starved aboard Royal Navy ships jumped to pirate crews where the pay was better and the beatings were fewer. Men like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Charles Vane became household names, terrorizing merchant vessels from Nassau to Madagascar. But here is the part that the legends always leave out. These pirates were constantly getting hurt, constantly getting sick, and they were dying in ways that had nothing to do with cannonballs or cutlasses. Scurvy alone, a disease caused by a simple lack of vitamin C, is estimated to have killed more than 2 million sailors between the first voyage to the New World and the mid-19th century. 2 million, that is not a battle, that is a plague. And scurvy was only one item on a very long list. Malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, dysentery, typhus, and of course, the disease that sailors feared almost as much as the gallows, syphilis, which they called the Great Pox. Now picture what scurvy actually looked like, because the word alone does not do it justice. A man's gums would swell and turn black. His teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds that had healed years ago would reopen as if the body had forgotten how to hold itself together. Bruises would bloom across the skin without any impact. The joints would swell until walking became impossible. And, in the final stages, the man would simply bleed internally until his organs failed. There was no dignity in it. There was no drama, just a slow, grotesque disintegration of the human body, one system at a time. The surgeon could do almost nothing about it, except beg the captain to make port somewhere with fresh fruit. Then add in the injuries. Cannon fire that sent wooden splinters the size of your forearm ripping through human flesh. Musket balls that shattered bone. Cutlass wounds that opened men from collarbone to hip. Falls from rigging that snapped legs and spines. Burns from gunpowder explosions. Infections from every cut and scrape that festered in the tropical humidity until a man's own flesh turned against him. A pirate ship without a surgeon was a floating death sentence, and every captain on every ocean knew it. So how did you get a surgeon onto a pirate ship? You asked nicely, right? Wrong. You stole one. This is perhaps the most fascinating and disturbing aspect of the pirate surgeon's existence. Nearly every pirate surgeon mentioned in the historical records from this era appears to have been forced into service. They were kidnapped, taken by violence from merchant vessels, navy ships, and trading posts. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. The pirates would board a vessel, round up the crew, and before they let anyone go, they would separate out the men they needed. Carpenters, because ships need constant repair. Navigators, because you need someone who can read the stars. And surgeons, because without one, your crew would rot from the inside out. Charles Johnson, the author of A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, describes this process plainly in his account of Captain William Fly. He writes that the pirates made several prizes, some of which they discharged, and put on board such of their forced men as begged their discharge. Others they sunk and burnt others. But forced on board carpenters, caulkers, armorers, surgeons, and musicians. Musicians, by the way, were also kidnapped, because apparently even pirates needed a soundtrack. But the surgeon's kidnapping was different from the others. A carpenter could be replaced. A navigator could be trained. A surgeon required years of study and practical experience that could not be improvised. When pirates captured a surgeon, they were capturing a walking, breathing medical facility. His knowledge, his hands, and his medicine chest were irreplaceable. And this created a deeply strange dynamic on the ship. The surgeon was not technically a pirate. He had not volunteered. He had not signed the Articles of Agreement by choice. In many cases, he was specifically told not to sign because the pirates themselves understood that a forced man had a better chance of surviving a trial if the authorities ever caught them. A surgeon who could prove he had been taken against his will might avoid the gallows. One who had willingly signed on was a dead man walking the moment the Royal Navy caught up. So the surgeon existed in a kind of limbo. He was a prisoner with privileges. He could not leave. He received a share of the plunder, typically 1.5 shares compared to a common sailor's 1 share. Under Henry Morgan's articles, the surgeon was guaranteed a salary of 250 pieces of 8+ compensation for his medicine chest. He ate the same food, drank the same rum, and sailed the same waters. But he was not free, and his workplace was a nightmare. Forget everything you have seen in movies. Forget the clean wooden tables and the dramatic lighting. Forget the captain bursting in to check on his first mate while the surgeon works in a spacious, well-lit cabin. The surgeon's operating theater was located in the lowest, darkest part of the ship. On larger vessels, this was the orlop deck, the level just above the hold where the bilge water sloshed and the rats lived. On smaller pirate ships, which were often sloops or brigantines with far less space, the surgeon worked wherever he could find room, which sometimes meant crouching between cannons with his surgical chest balanced on a barrel. The conditions were almost impossible to comprehend by modern standards. There was no electric light. The surgeon worked by the glow of tallow candles stuck into iron holders bolted to the walls. The ship was constantly moving, rolling with the waves, which meant that during surgery, the patient, the surgeon, and every instrument on the table could shift unpredictably. Navy surgeon John Atkins recommended placing large lights in sticking iron candlesticks, noting that they were less disturbed by the motions of the ship. But even the most stable candlestick could not compensate for a rogue wave in the middle of an amputation. The smell was indescribable. Bilge water, unwashed bodies, rotting food, gunpowder residue, and the unavoidable stench of infected wounds, all combined in a space with virtually no ventilation. The surgeon worked surrounded by this, breathing it in while trying to keep his hands steady enough to cut through muscle and bone. And he did this without anesthesia. Let that settle for a second. There was no morphine, no ether, no chloroform, no numbing agent of any kind that actually worked. Some surgeons gave their patients rum or brandy before a major procedure, but alcohol is a blood thinner that makes bleeding worse, and drunk patients have a tendency to become combative, which is exactly what you do not want when you are holding a saw against someone's femur. What the surgeons did have, ironically, was adrenaline. They discovered that immediately after battle, when the blood was still pumping and the body was flooded with its own natural painkillers, patients tolerated surgery far better than if they were left to sit and think about what was coming. Navy surgeon John Atkins wrote that heat and surprise in action makes it the properest time for amputating because men meet their misfortunes with greater strength and resolution than when they had spent a night under thought and reflection. In other words, the best time to cut off a man's leg was right after someone had tried to kill him, while the shock was still fresh, while the adrenaline was still screaming through his veins, before he had time to be afraid. So imagine this. A sea battle has just ended. The deck is slippery with blood. Men are screaming. The ship reeks of gunpowder and burning wood. And below deck, in the dim, swaying belly of the vessel, the surgeon is already at work. His assistants, often just whichever crew members could stomach the sight, would carry the wounded down to him one by one. The surgeon would assess each man quickly. Splinter wound to the thigh can wait. Musket ball lodged in the shoulder, painful but survivable. Shattered forearm with the bone exposed and fragments of wood embedded in the tissue. That arm is coming off. The amputation procedure during this era was brutal but surprisingly standardized. The surgeon would first apply a tourniquet above the wound to control bleeding. Then he would take his amputation knife, a long, curved blade designed specifically for the purpose, and make 2 sweeping cuts around the limb in a half-moon pattern, slicing through skin and muscle down to the bone. He would then peel the flesh back, exposing the bone beneath. Next came the saw. A specialized bone saw, not unlike a modern carpentry saw but with finer teeth, was drawn back and forth across the bone until it separated. The entire procedure, from first cut to severed limb, was expected to take no more than a few minutes. Speed was essential, both because the patient was in agony and because the longer the wound was open, the greater the risk of infection. Once the limb was removed, it was tossed into a waiting bucket. Sea surgeon John Moyle described keeping 2 vessels nearby during operations, one with water to wash hands between procedures and to wet the bandages, and the other to throw amputated limbs into until there was an opportunity to heave them overboard. The stump then had to be sealed. In earlier centuries, this was done with boiling tar or a red-hot iron pressed directly against the raw flesh, a process called cauterization that was every bit as horrifying as it sounds. By the golden age of piracy, surgeons had begun using ligatures, tying off the blood vessels with thread, and covering the wound with linen dressings. But cauterization was still common, especially on ships where supplies were limited and speed mattered more than finesse. And after all of that, the patient's survival was still far from guaranteed. Without antibiotics, infection was almost inevitable. A wound that looked clean on Monday could be septic by Wednesday and fatal by Friday. The surgeon could do everything right: perform a textbook amputation, seal the wound perfectly, change the dressings daily, and still lose the patient to gangrene or blood poisoning because the microscopic world of bacteria was still completely unknown. Now, here is something that will probably surprise you about pirate ships. They actually had a healthcare system. I know that sounds absurd, but it is true. The Articles of Agreement, the pirate code that every crew member signed before a voyage, included a detailed compensation schedule for injuries sustained in battle. Under Bartholomew Roberts' articles, one of the most well-documented sets of pirate rules from the early 1720s, the rates were specific. Loss of a right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8. A left arm, 500. A right leg, 500. A left leg, 400. An eye, 100. Even a single finger was worth 100 pieces of 8. These payments came from the common stock, the shared plunder pool that every crew member contributed to. It was, in effect, a disability insurance system. A pirate who lost a limb in battle was compensated from the group's collective wealth. Historians have pointed out that this compensation scheme predated any similar system in the legitimate workforce by well over a century. Pirates, of all people, had workers' compensation before factory workers did, and the surgeon was at the center of all of it. He was the one who determined the severity of the injury. He was the one who decided whether a limb could be saved or had to come off. His word carried enormous weight in disputes over compensation because he was the closest thing the ship had to a medical authority. But his duties extended far beyond the operating table. The pirate surgeon was also the ship's pharmacist, mixing remedies from whatever materials he could gather or steal. His medicine chest, which was considered so valuable that it was specifically mentioned in the pirate articles alongside his salary, contained everything from herbal tinctures to mercury-based treatments for syphilis, which were nearly as dangerous as the disease itself. He treated fevers with bark extracts. He lanced boils and abscesses. He set broken bones with wooden splints. He treated scurvy with whatever citrus he could find, though the actual cause of the disease would not be scientifically understood for decades. He was also the ship's barber. This was not a side gig or a hobby. During this era, surgeons and barbers were essentially the same profession. The barber-surgeon tradition stretched back centuries, and at sea, the two roles were inseparable. The surgeon cut hair, shaved beards, trimmed whiskers, and pulled teeth. The crew addressed him as Mr., not Doctor, because the title of doctor was reserved for academically trained physicians who would never have been caught dead on a pirate sloop in the Caribbean. And then there were the diseases. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The endless, relentless, soul-crushing diseases. A pirate ship was a floating petri dish. Dozens of men crammed into tight quarters with limited fresh water, limited sanitation, and food that was often crawling with weevils before it even left port. The ship's surgeon was expected to manage all of it. Dysentery, which could sweep through a crew like wildfire, killing men through dehydration and exhaustion. Tropical fevers picked up from port visits in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean. Infections from the most minor of wounds. Because in an environment where everything was damp, dirty, and salt-encrusted, even a small cut could become a death sentence. And the surgeon could not quit. He could not resign his position and take a shore leave. He could not refer a difficult case to a specialist. He was the only medical professional for hundreds of miles in every direction, and every single life on the ship depended on whatever knowledge he carried in his head and whatever tools he carried in his chest. Some surgeons thrived in this environment. Alexander Exquemelin, who served as a surgeon under the legendary privateer-turned-pirate Henry Morgan in the 1660s and 1670s, went on to write one of the most important first-hand accounts of piracy ever published. His book, The Buccaneers of America, published in 1678, is still considered a primary source for understanding the culture and practices of Caribbean piracy. Exquemelin documented everything, from the Articles of Agreement to the surgical procedures he performed to the battle tactics Morgan employed. His account is one of the reasons we know as much as we do about how pirates actually lived, fought, and died. Others were not so fortunate. When Captain John Phillips's pirate crew found themselves without a surgeon, they held what Johnson describes as a learned consultation to decide what to do about Phillips's badly injured leg. The solution was to send for the ship's carpenter, Thomas Fern, who was deemed the most proper man for the job. Fern fetched the biggest saw he could find, took the leg under his arm, and separated it from the body in about as much time as it would take him to cut through a plank of wood. Phillips survived. Somehow, but the story illustrates just how desperate pirate crews became without a surgeon. A carpenter with a wood saw was considered an acceptable substitute for a trained medical professional. That is how valuable the surgeon was. That is how irreplaceable his skills were. Without him, a carpenter was the best they had. The surgeon's relationship with the rest of the crew was also complicated in ways that defy simple description. He was respected, certainly. Nobody wanted to antagonize the man who might be digging a musket ball out of your shoulder next week. He received better pay, better quarters in most cases, and a degree of personal safety that ordinary sailors did not enjoy. Pirates who fought and killed with casual abandon would think twice before threatening their surgeon, because his death would mean their own the next time a battle went badly. But he was also isolated. The surgeon was often the most educated man on the ship, a literate professional surrounded by men who could not read. He had been taken from a world of medical practice, apprenticeships, and guild membership and thrown into a world of violence, rum, and open-ocean lawlessness. He was neither fully part of the crew nor fully separate from it. He participated in the spoils of piracy without having chosen the life. He saved the lives of men who had stolen him from his own. And his legal position was precarious in the extreme. If the ship was captured by the Royal Navy or by colonial authorities, the surgeon faced the same gallows as everyone else unless he could prove he had been forced aboard against his will. This is why many surgeons refused to sign the articles. Not signing meant forfeiting his share of the plunder in many cases, but it also meant maintaining a legal defense that might keep him alive if the worst happened. Some surgeons managed to walk this tightrope successfully. John Devine, a surgeon who served with pirates in the early 1700s, eventually settled in Boston in 1704, apparently having convinced the authorities that his service had been involuntary. He is one of the very few pirate surgeons known to have escaped the life with both his freedom and his share of the plunder intact. But for most, the position was a trap, a golden cage bolted shut with a lock that only death or capture could open. Now, let us talk about what happened when a pirate ship went into battle, because this was when the surgeon's nightmare truly began. The call to quarters would sound, and every man aboard would rush to his station. The gunners would load the cannons. The sharpshooters would climb the rigging. The boarding party would gather their cutlasses and pistols, and the surgeon would descend into the lowest part of the ship, to the cockpit or the orlop deck, and begin preparing for the worst. He would lay out his instruments on a barrel or a makeshift table. Amputation knives, bone saws, scalpels, retractors, needles, and forceps, all arranged in the order he expected to need them. One surgeon, Edward Ives, recommended carrying 6 or more amputation knives instead of the usual 2 or 3, because during the chaos of battle there was no time to sharpen a dulled blade. He gave the same advice about saws, needles, and other instruments, noting that many were lost or misplaced during the noise and confusion. Buckets of water were placed nearby for washing hands between operations. An empty bucket was set aside for blood, another for limbs. Candles were lit and secured in their iron holders. Bandages were stacked. Whatever medicines were available were set within arm's reach. And then the surgeon waited. He could hear the battle above him, the thunder of cannons, the crack of muskets, the screaming of men, the splintering of wood as cannonballs tore through the hull. And with each crash, he knew that his work was about to begin. The wounded started arriving, carried down by shipmates, dragging themselves along the deck, bleeding, moaning, some already unconscious. The surgeon would triage them quickly, just as a modern emergency room doctor would. The ones who could be saved with minor treatment went to one side. The ones who needed major surgery went to the table. The ones who were beyond help were given rum and left to die as comfortably as the situation allowed. And then the cutting began. Hour after hour, the surgeon would work, amputating limbs, extracting musket balls and splinters, stitching wounds closed with needles and thread made from animal gut, cauterizing bleeding vessels with hot irons, all of it by candlelight, all of it on a rocking, swaying ship, all of it surrounded by the screams of his patients and the ongoing sounds of battle above. Sea Surgeon John Moyle left detailed accounts of his own experiences performing surgery at sea. He described the preparation of his workspace with clinical precision, the placement of instruments, the positioning of candles, the arrangement of water buckets and bandages. But even in his methodical descriptions, the horror of the situation bleeds through. The surgeon was alone in a way that no modern doctor can truly understand. There was no backup, no second opinion, no sterile operating theater with proper lighting and climate control. There was just a man with a knife, a candle, and the knowledge in his head, working against time and the tides to keep his crewmates alive. And when the battle was over, his work continued. Infections set in within days. Fevers spiked. Wounds that had been cleanly sutured would reopen or begin to suppurate. The surgeon would make his rounds, changing dressings, mixing poultices, trying to coax his patients back from the edge with tools and knowledge that were, by any modern standard, desperately primitive. Some of his patients would recover. They would heal, adapt to their missing limbs, collect their compensation from the common stock, and return to duty with a wooden leg or a hook where a hand used to be. The image of the peg-legged pirate is not a myth. It is a direct consequence of the surgeon's work. Those men walked because a surgeon saved them. They lived because someone who had been stolen from his own life chose or was forced to preserve theirs. Others were not so lucky. They died of infections that a modern course of antibiotics would have cleared in a week. They died of fevers that a single dose of modern medicine could have broken. They died in the dark, on a rocking ship, surrounded by the smell of their own rotting wounds, with the surgeon sitting beside them, unable to do anything more. That was the pirate surgeon's reality. Not the romantic figure of popular imagination, but a man caught between worlds, a prisoner who saved lives, a professional reduced to barbering and bloodletting, a healer trapped aboard a ship of killers, performing impossible medicine under impossible conditions, with the knowledge that his only way home was if the pirates either released him, were captured by authorities who might hang him too, or simply died and left him aboard a drifting ship with no crew and no course. The golden age of piracy ended in the mid-1720s, choked out by increased naval patrols, colonial crackdowns, and the simple economic reality that piracy was becoming less profitable and more dangerous. The great captains were hunted down, captured, and hanged. Their ships were burned or seized. Their crews were scattered, and the surgeons who had served aboard those ships disappeared into history. A few, like John Devine, managed to slip back into respectable society. Others died at sea or on the gallows, their names lost to time. And a small handful, like Alexander Exquemelin, left behind written records that allow us to peer into a world that was simultaneously terrifying and extraordinary. Because the truth about the pirate surgeon is this: he was not a pirate. He was not a victim, exactly. He was something in between. A man who existed in the spaces between violence and healing, between captivity and survival, between the law and the sea. He was the most valuable person on the most lawless ships in the most dangerous waters on earth. And every single night he went to sleep knowing that tomorrow might bring another battle, another amputation, another patient he could not save, and another day spent trapped in a life he never chose. The medicine chest beside his bunk, the candle guttering in its iron holder, the ship rocking beneath him, headed toward whatever coast or conflict the captain had chosen. The pirate surgeon's watch never ended. It just continued until someone decided it was over. And usually, that someone was not him. We remember the captains. We remember the battles. We remember the treasure and the flags and the names that have echoed through 3 centuries of myth and legend. Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, Bartholomew Roberts. These are the names that fill the books and the movies and the theme park rides. But somewhere beneath the deck, below the cannons and the cargo and the waterline, there was always a surgeon, unnamed, unremembered, holding a blade in one hand and a candle in the other, doing the only thing he could do in a world that had swallowed him whole, keeping them alive, one terrifying, impossible surgery at a time.